How's the sound? Need more
Excellent.
volume? That better?
Yes.
Welcome, everyone. We have a diverse crowd from a lot of different places. Still too soft?
Keep right into the mic.
I am. But maybe I better turn it up some more. How's that? Better? Okay. First of all, Dana and Christine and Lila, who is Grandma Judy's and my only grandchild, here from Northern Virginia. We thought that Judy's brother and family were here from Chicago. Either gotten lost or something, so just too bad we can't wait. And from all around Southern California, neighboring states, big UCLA, UC contingent, squirrel, and welcome also to those on Zoom from other places all around the US, but also England, I know of, and Australia, where it's now almost 3:45 in the morning when we got up. So good day, mates. Welcome. I'd just like to say a few words about the setting here, because it's particularly appropriate for a memorial to Judy, because it brings in two very high values of hers, nature and science. Nature was a main focus of our travels over the years, places like Kauai and Big Sur and the Yorkshire Dales especially. And even in her waning years where she was not very strong anymore, one thing that she really loved doing is walking around the neighborhood and seeing the flowers and the plants and things that were coming alive. So that's what makes this a special place. But most important is the connection to her career. The Botanical Gardens is a place that she came to often because her lab was for many years at the beginning, and people here probably know exactly when. I don't, but right across the street in the Center for Health Sciences. So this was came here for lab parties and various events, and sometimes just for some nice quiet. So that was an important part of the connection to her career. From the time of junior high school, Judy wanted to be a research scientist, and she was single-minded about that. If there were obstacles like disapproving and unsupportive parents, she didn't let that get in her way. But she took part-time jobs at the University of Michigan to help pay for her undergraduate tuition. And from my perspective, she showed no interest in being famous. She did not think of herself or want to be thought of as a woman scientist. She wanted to be thought of as a scientist, and that's how she thought of herself. And very fortunately, the men that she dealt with over her career had the same attitude, and they accepted her for what she was as a scientist, smart and dedicated. So I thank them for that, and you'll hear from many of them in a few minutes. Judy loved her career, despite the difficulties of dealing with personnel problems when she was the vice chair of the pathology department. And despite the trauma of getting grants. In fact, the only time she wavered in her career choices was when she was waiting to hear about a grant. She invariably had a backup career. Usually a high school science teacher. But fortunately, that did not have to materialize. But the difficulties she encountered were really minor in in her mind compared to the excitement of research, gaining knowledge, uncovering scientific mysteries, making new connections, and then mentoring and teaching students from undergrads up to postdocs. Judy, as many of you undoubtedly know, was very unassuming. So I have to say that as a non-scientist, I did not fully appreciate her achievements. And it wasn't until I started getting spontaneous emails and texts from many of you, but from her colleagues and students, that I was really overwhelmed and shocked by the response. And so I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So thank you. Judy got the career she wanted, and it was a long and fulfilling one. It's hard for me to accept that she's really gone, but the tree that we're dedicating today will be a wonderful and long-lasting memory and a fitting memorial. So with that, let me turn the mic over to Dana, because what we have today is thanks to her. Thanks because this was all her idea. She went through with it with her usual determination, and took a long time, but we've got it. So.
A little bit shorter than my father, so let's lower that. My father talked, is this, can you guys hear me? Okay. My father talked about why this garden is the right location to remember my mother. And a tree dedication is particularly appropriate because my mother loved trees. Every single time that we passed by a tree that had light shining through leaves in this exact way, which you can see right over there. But, oh, and right here, she would point it out to me. And now, every time that I see a tree with light shining through leaves in just that way, I remember her. And sometimes I even point it out to my daughter in the same way that she did to me. Thank you, Christine, Marie, and Jake, for helping me to select the particular tree that we've chosen. And it's the right tree for two reasons. First, it's a fig tree. And not only did my mother love to eat figs, but she also really liked fig trees. And there was a Moreton Bay fig right near my parents' house that we used to visit and admire all of the time. And it was one of her very favorite trees. And the second reason is that the tree has a very, if you haven't seen it yet, you can go afterwards. It's got a very large trunk and many, many branches. And I like to think that it represents her research, where she discovered so much about the basic mechanisms of heart disease and molecules bonding to endothelial cells. And you guys know that stuff way better than I do. But out of that has grown many, many branches of research. And so I think it's a nice representation of that. I'd like to share one memory of my mother. For those of you who know her professionally, you may not know that she really loved poetry. And she wrote poetry when she was younger. She worked on a literary journal in college. She particularly enjoyed Auden and T.S. Eliot. There were others, but I remember those the most. And when I was in high school, first learning to understand poetry, my mother and I would sometimes talk about the meaning of poems. And one that I found particularly puzzling was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, which is particularly hard to decode if you've read it. And it's a sad poem about a person who never took a chance and never dared to live the life that he wanted. And it is about, sorry.
Let us go that you and I, when the evening spread out against the sky, Temptation neath the rise upon the table.
Exactly. Thank you. It is, it's really about his realization, looking back on his life, that he had nothing to show for it and nothing to be proud that he had done. Over the years, I've thought back many times to that conversation with my mother, and what strikes me most now about that afternoon at the dining room table is how fitting it was that it was my mother that I walked through that poem with, because she had already understood that lesson, and she was not like that at all. She was not a person who let life pass her by. She was not a person who missed out on the things she cared about. She had many, many things to be proud of. My mother chose exactly what she wanted to do with her life, both personally and professionally, every step of the way, and then she did it. One of the things, of course, that she chose was her career, and many of her colleagues have come to and have asked to talk about some of the things that she accomplished there. And I am going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First up, Tom Drake, if you would like to come and talk to us. Thank you.
That was unexpected. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I came to UCLA in 1984 department. Is this okay? No.
Raise it.
There we go. Better? Close. Just the mic.
Okay, I'm not one of those close people. I will try here. So I came to UCLA in the Department of Pathology, which Judy was already a member of, in 1984. And to try to summarize somebody who I've known for essentially her whole life since I came and interacted with, was her generosity when she really had no reason to have to help me. You know, we were totally different things, but she was generous with teaching me and helping me with projects that I had, because we shared some scientific things together with that. And all of that led to me meeting many of you here who know me through the PPG. And so that was essentially the rest of her career and mine as well. And the second area to mention is that I chaired general pathology teaching for many years, and she was already doing that when I came, and she was an excellent teacher and was always helpful. And the one thing I remember somewhere after a couple, maybe even 2 decades, was we had somebody who taught atherosclerosis, which is what she was focused on. And I said, Judy, would you be willing to lecture on this? And she said, she probably didn't say, oh my God, but it was like, thank you so much. You know, I've spent my life studying this, but I've never been able to give a regular lecture to medical students. So that was a memorable response, and it made me glad that I offered it to her. She was wonderful.
Peter Edwards. I think people know that my mother had a joint appointment in pathology and medicine. So thank you.
Well, I'll read this a little because I don't want to go over time. But ladies and gentlemen, friends of Judy, it's an honor actually to add a few comments about Judy. Although we were in different departments, Judy and I were scientific colleagues and friends at UCLA for over 3 decades. We were part of an NIH-funded program project headed by Alan Fogelman with Jake and various other people, which was renewed every 5 years for over 30 years. There were many things, thinking back, there were many things that made Judy special. But basically it came down to the fact that she was extremely smart and insightful. She was also extremely thoughtful. She was extremely dedicated, both to the science and to the well-being of young scientists, whether graduate students or postdocs. She was highly considerate of others. She was highly empathetic. She had a high moral code, and she was always willing to help. For example, for over 30 years, I especially valued Judy's willingness to critique my preliminary graph proposals as we five professors got together to submit yet another 5-year grant proposal. I could rely on Judy's critique being complete, detailed, and particularly helpful. Thank you, Judy, for those many hours you spent commenting on my drafts. I'll leave it to others to tell you about Judy's scientific accomplishments. But you should know that she made major findings, contributions to our understanding on the role of oxidized lipids, which many of you don't know what they are, and especially oxidized phospholipids, and how they affected a number of disease states, including atherosclerosis. Her accomplishments were major and led to a number of well-deserved honors, both from UCLA and nationally from the American Heart Association. But it was at lunches with Judy where I learned what else turned Judy on besides science. And you've already heard something from Dana, but I learned other things. I learned how proud she and Mike were of Dana's accomplishments, especially when Dana successfully argued and won an eminent domain case in front of the Supreme Court. That was a big deal for Judy. Probably a big deal for you too. I learned how Judy loved to be grandma to little Lila. Since my wife, also named Judy, and I have a granddaughter called Emiko, who is 1 year older than Lila, there was a common thread at these lunches. In addition to science, we would talk about how our little granddaughters were growing up. I also learned how Judy and Mike loved to hike. In particular, Judy seemed to love the Yorkshire Dales of Northern England, a place 2 hours away from where I grew up. But there was a bigger coincidence. As one day, Judy was extolling about this little village in the Dales where she and Mike stayed in this white painted house for a bed and breakfast on the edge of the Dales, and how they'd hiked on the moors there. It turned out that my wife and I also loved to hike, and that we had actually coincidentally stayed in the little white house, taken some of the same walks as they had taken, and I'm sure drank at the same only pub in the little village many times. So Judy and I shared not only a love for science, but a love for travel and hiking and being grandparents to little girls. Judy was a friend and a valued colleague, and she is missed. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to, with a different angle, to talk about Judy. Okay. My name is Zhuang Ting Fan. All my old boss, Dr. Judy Briner, call me John. I'm a clinical professor of David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, Department of Anesthesiology and Perioperative Medicine. I'm associate director of the Washington Stein operating rooms. I'm a fellow of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. And also I'm a board member and two-term president of the Ophthalmic Anesthesia Society and author for several chapters in anesthesia textbooks. Without Judy, I would not be able to share about all these so-called achievements with you here today. 32 years ago, I was finishing my master's degree at UCLA School of Public Health. When I went to UCLA Career Center, I found an adverse advertisement for a lab technician praised by Judy. So I went to Warren Hall for an interview. I have no idea how that went because of my broken English at the time. 2 days later, I went to for another interview with the UCLA cancer researcher. I suppose not to mention his name, but he's right here today, Dr. Hickinson, right here. And the interview is in the same building, same floor, 2 doors down from Judy's lab. I walked very quickly when I passed Judy's lab because I didn't want her to see me. The interview went well, and Dr. Hickinson gave me a tour of his lab. But sure enough, we ran Judy in the hallway. And she immediately asked me, "What are you doing here? Come to see me when you're done." I had a lot of explanation to Dr. Hickinson. I'm so sorry for that. So I was sweating profusely when I stepped into Judy's office. She said, "John, you can't do that because I already decided to hire you after rejecting other 25 applicants." I was in absolute shock. But also so incredibly grateful and happy that Judy was willing to take a chance on me. Ever since stepping foot in her lab, she has taught me so much and ever inspired me in the ways I teach. She made me feel accepted and was always dedicated to support her employees and the impressive amount of research she has accomplished over the year. Funnily enough, my fellow co-workers at Judy's lab, including PhD students Andrew Watson, Dr. Farha Pahami, and postdoc Jung Kim, and many other medical students, which made us one big, happy, multicultural family. Once I started working with Judy, I knew I now have a great boss who is nice and fair. So fair, she allowed me to not come to the campus on weekends to change cell culture media because I live far away from UCLA campus. Of course, I have to work very, very hard to earn that. Back then, I didn't have much money. I was driving a Dodge Colt E hatchback without radio or air conditioning. You can imagine how hot my car was with the window down in 110-degree LA summer freeway. One summer, I got heat stroke and was very sick. When I went back to work, Judy handed me 2 thermoses, and she ordered me to fill with ice water before I leave the lab and finish them before I got home. She was always so thoughtful in that way. During the 6 years, I worked for Judy from 1990 to 1996. A lot of major events happened. The LA riot, the Northridge earthquake, and the birth of my daughter. Judy always made sure my family and I were safe. She was so supportive when I told her I want to pursue my medical career, and even wrote me recommendation letters for my residency application. Without Judy, I would not be where I am today. Judy has always been a great teacher, scientist, and inspiration to me. She will be always my wonderful boss. My family and I forever grateful for her kindness, care, and support. We will miss you, Judy. We will love you, Judy. Thank you.
Alan Sokelman.
So we heard from Mike and Dana about how Judy was so observant. In science, sometimes that's called serendipity. Many of us that are in this audience today have spent our career, louder, better. Many of us in this audience have spent our career working on molecules that we learned about because of Judy. The start of this work occurred at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. In 1990, Judy published a first author publication in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, a very prestigious journal. And in that journal article, she described how mildly oxidized LDL caused white blood cells known as monocytes to adhere to the endothelial cells, the lining of arteries. It turns out that the way Judy found her way to studying this was that some of the preparations of the low density lipoproteins, LDL, the bad cholesterol in the vernacular, had been left in the refrigerator too long. And when she added them to cultures of endothelial cells, they behaved very differently than the LDL preparations that were not left in the refrigerator for very long. Most people would have thrown that away and thought that it was infected, it was something like that. Judy didn't. And that was a remarkable ability of hers to recognize something unusual and to then try to understand it. And from that observation, she then went to decipher what was it in this complex of protein and fats that was causing the lining of the arteries, the endothelium, to react as if there was a tuberculosis bacteria present. And she dissected that and gave a career to a lot of us here. I think that's something that is very unusual. And I think it fits with Judy's ability to understand T.S. Eliot and take the time to do that, and her ability to look around her in nature and to see the differences and the wonder. Her gift was not just being able to find important things in science, but as we've heard, she had this remarkable ability to touch others and to share with them her wonderment, her work ethic, her approach, her goodness, and her life will live on through many who are not here today because what she did, the way she lived her life, and because of her family was so remarkable.
I'm going to try to adjust with my. To those of us who were not scientists, my mother talked about that molecule a lot, which she called the mystery molecule. And I heard about the mystery molecule for years until she figured out what it actually was. But I remember very well that was such a huge center of research for a long time. Okay. I just. Niall Hankinson.
So I'm Noel Hankinson. My real name is Oliver Hankinson. I go by the nickname Noel. And Judy was one of the friends at UCLA, one of the few friends actually who knew me as Noel. So I knew Judy for many years from a slightly different perspective from several of the other speakers, and that is from her teaching. I came to UCLA in 1979 to the lab of nuclear medicine and radiation biology, as it was then called, in Warren Hall. It then changed its name several years ago to the Lab of Biomedical and Environmental Sciences. It was a Department of Energy lab, and it's rather physically removed from the main UCLA campus. It's a 15, 20-minute walk away. And I had my labs there, as I mentioned, and I was rather isolated. I had other companions who did research, but I was a little isolated from the main campus. But Judy was in my department, the Department of Pathology. And she took it upon herself to take charge of my career in a certain way and introduce me to the other pathology people. So she would make me come over and talk to the other pathologists, like I see some of them here now. I think I precede most of them who are here. And introduce me to them and get me involved in the pathology teaching. One of the things she did was enroll me as a co-teacher of the graduate student seminar series. Now, this was a series where students would present research papers and critique them. And so it's a very effective way, obviously, for students to understand science and critique science. Most of the students were very hesitant to participate. They're shy, diffident. But Judy had a knack for getting them to open up in a very unthreatening manner. She had a great ability to get people to talk about science and to discuss it. Even the quietest student would do so. And I think what the students recognized is her whole motivation was to improve their scientific ability. Her ego was not in the slightest way involved. And I think that's a theme we've heard from other speakers, that Judy did not have a standard ego. She was not concerned about fame or our standard measures of success that many of us go by. She wanted to help people and to teach. So my experience with her in that seminar series, which lasted several years, really has helped me in my own. I've tried to emulate her approach when I have led seminars, which I still do in the molecular toxicology program. That way of trying to get students involved, trying to invoke a response without being threatening. So after those several years with Judy, I sort of lost contact with her to some degree. We used to meet each other occasionally and chat, but it was those first 10 years I was at UCLA that were so formative for me and were so helped by Judy. We occasionally had chats, like Peter Edward. I heard all about the Yorkshire Dales. I'm not a Yorkshireman, but we discussed them and it was fun. And she was just such a warm, generous person who's had a major effect on my career. And I think she lived quite clearly a blessed life.
Center, please.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Sang-Dirk Lee. I'm working at Sanders Brown Center on Aging, University of Kentucky. Firstly, I offer my condolences to Judy's family for their loss. Starting in 2006, for the 7 years, I was under Judy's tutelage while I'm completing my postdoc. I received much academic help from her. Looking back, I realized that Judy helped and pushed me in the shadows through that period. During my postdoc years and even after, I was supported by Judy's wisdom and knowledge. As I continue to research atherosclerosis, now I'm working on Alzheimer's disease and more. I also continue to receive help from Judy's research and accomplishments, especially as new studies continue to identify oxidized phospholipid as a common mechanism of a chronic inflammatory disease. I'm certain that the decades-long research Judy fulfilled will be acknowledged even more greatly in the future, I'm sure. With the guidance I have received from her, I hope to foster my and more academic passion and my results so that I can follow in her footsteps in the future. I'm very grateful that through this significant ceremony, Judy, who tirelessly worked for scientific research and helped her disciples grow, can be remembered through the dedication of this tree. I hope to see soon the tree. It is also my honor to see the scientists, wonderful scientists I respect, who worked together with Judy on her research on atherosclerosis and many chronic inflammatory mechanisms on these days. I once again wish to express my sympathy to Mike and Dana, and thank you then for preparing this deeply meaningful event. Thank you.
Jake? This is.
I'm Jake Lucis. I was a colleague of Judy's for about 40 years. And she was a gentle, as has been mentioned, a gentle, humble, genuine individual. And has also been mentioned, she really, developed a novel area of biology, an important area that involved biological functions of oxidized lipids. And, but, when I was thinking about what to say today, I thought, the thing that stood out for me most was her mentorship. And in the early 2000s, she downsized her lab a little bit, and we decided to combine labs and share the same laboratory space. Sandgren was one of the people that was in the lab at that time. And Judy would, not all days, but many days, come into the laboratory, and she would go desk by desk by desk to all the students. My students, her students. And she would sit down with them, and she would look at the notebooks and look at the previous day's experiments, and then just discuss what to do next. This is very unusual. And yeah, as has also been mentioned, she had a big impact on a lot of students. I know some particularly which had just a very large impact. She was a role model, particularly women, I believe, and just a really inspiring, wonderful person.
Farhad?
Good morning. My name is Farhad Marhami. I don't think I have met many of you here, but I'm currently founder, CEO, and president of Max Biopharma, which is a preclinical company here in Santa Monica. As a sophomore at UCLA, I really wanted to pursue a medical career as a physician. And sometimes some people come into your life that completely change your destiny. Or perhaps they become the facilitator for you to reach your destiny. When I was a sophomore, I joined Judy's lab as a lab helper in the atherosclerosis research unit, and worked my way up from washing dishes to becoming a lab assistant, and stayed with her until I graduated with a bachelor's degree. So a year before graduating, I applied to 2 medical schools, USC and UCLA, and I did not get into any of them. And because of some family situation that I had at that time, my parents had just come here from Iran from a bloody revolution. I had to stay with them. And the fact that I hadn't gotten into medical school was quite upsetting. So one day, and of course, Judy had witnessed everything. She pulled me into her office and sat me down, and I said, Farhad, I have seen you work in my lab for many years. And I believe that you really have in you to become a very successful scientist and researcher. Why don't you apply to the PhD program in the Department of Pathology and work with me and get your PhD. And then if you want to, you can later on apply to medical school again. Well, that was the end of my aspirations to become a physician. So since then, I spent my career 22 years as faculty member here in the Department of Medicine, Division of Cardiology. I started this company, Max Biopharma, in 2011 and left UCLA in 2017 to join the company full time. But if there is any success that I can claim is Judy's success too. Because what I learned from her was how to be a good scientist and how to perform science in the most rigorous way. If there is a question, you don't go after it with just one solution or one mechanism. You go after it using many strategies. And if all of those strategies tell you the same thing, then you've proven your hypothesis. And I have used that rigor in order to expand my vascular biology training into stem cell biology, cancer biology, bone biology, and many other areas that my company now is involved with. From that day that I became a lab helper in her lab, she became my academic mother. She really took me under her wings, and throughout my training and then throughout the times that I was a professor here, and then even after that, when I left UCLA, she really genuinely wanted to know that I was okay. We would meet regularly for lunch, sometimes here at UCLA, sometimes at a deli near her home in Westwood. And she listened, and she definitely wanted to know that I was okay. And I always reassured her that yes, I was okay. I have a lot of memories with Judy, and I'm not gonna, tell you all about them right now. But if there was one person that really made the most impact in who I am now and what I have been able to succeed and do and accomplish, was Judy. 2 years ago, unfortunately, I lost my biologic mother, which was very hard. And then the day that Jake actually told me that Judy had passed away, it was almost as equally hard because I had lost my academic mother. I will always cherish the times that I had with her, everything that she taught me. And I believe in heaven, and I know that she's there now, still watching over us. And I hope that she rests in peace, and I hope that her memory will always be a blessing to Mike and Dana and her beautiful granddaughter, and to the rest of us that she really touched so deeply. Thank you.
Joe,
Thank you for asking me to speak. Judy was very special to me. Judy was very special to me. I'm Joe Wisdom, and I'm at UCSD. I am an academic colleague of Alan and all the group in the PPG here. I think I've been started coming as advisor in the mid 1980s, as far as I can remember. And in the context, I remember very distinctly meeting Judy the first time. And I was immediately struck by two things: her warmth and her scientific rigor. And it reminded me of a story that I've actually heard repeated many times this morning. In Europe, in the Jewish shtetls, when a young boy came to first day to come or to school, and he was supposed to start learning his letters alpha, and they would form those letters with honey and put it on a piece of paper. And then when the child took his first lesson, he would dip his finger in the aleph and taste it. And his mentor would say to him, his teacher, "This is what the beauty of learning is like." And then, of course, the teacher was very, very strict, but always in the background of the sweetness of the first lesson. And that's what Judy always was to me through many years of working together. The other aspect that I was very honored to be able to work with Judy was that in the context of our coming together, you heard that she just really described, really for the first time, the importance of these molecules called oxidized phospholipids, initially in the context of oxidized LDL and atherogenesis, but later became more widespread. And Judy and her colleagues worked out with Jake and others all the important molecular biology of it. In the beginning, all of these studies were done in the laboratory. And in the context of my own work, I discovered an antibody that would bind to oxidized phospholipids very uniquely. And in very early collaborative studies, Judy actually helped me define what was the exact portion of the molecule that on the oxidized phospholipid that are antibody bound. We published a number of papers together. And later, as I mentioned, there had not been any in vivo proof exactly that oxidized phospholipids are important. And what you have to understand is that what Judy pioneered has become an industry. There are actually 22,000 papers published about oxidized phospholipids, and in large part, that all stems from the pioneering work that Judy did. Well, a few years ago, we were able to make a mouse, transgenic mouse, that expressed this antibody at high concentration. And therefore, we could test in vivo whether or not oxidized phospholipids were important or not. And we put these into the background of a high cholesterol fed mouse, which allowed us to test its impact on atherosclerosis. And we found that, lo and behold, it really did inhibit atherosclerosis. And it was very specific just to the molecules that Judy had been studying. And my first, and this is really true, my first person that I wanted to share this data with was Judy. And I sent her an email. It was the greatest joy. It's like when you want to tell your parent, something you did good, you send them their email. But I wanted to share this with, in a way, my intellectual parent, Judy. But Judy was more because she was also such a warm, supportive person. And at her retirement, I was able to share some of that first data of where it was actually published. And since then, we published a whole series of papers using these mice to show literally everything that she had predicted was important, including on the bone. And I routinely send her emails about describing this work, and except for the very last, I always got a lovely response. And I know, and I hope that this brought her a lot of joy to show that everything she had done, she was so modest, but in fact, everything she had done was was truly groundbreaking and important. And I really miss Judy very much. And I thank you and thank your family for inviting me to share these thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the scientists who have spoken today. It's been nice for me because I've heard snippets of all of these things over the years. I remember the nuclear medicine building. I washed dishes in the lab one summer. And I remember, of course, hearing about the program project, the grad student seminar. And actually, I remember hearing about the mice. That was something that she was really excited about. I remember learning about the knockout mice, and then when that discovery was made about how it worked in vivo, she actually told me about it. So it's been nice to kind of tie all that together. And her enthusiasm for science definitely continued even after her retirement. She was still looking at people's papers and talking to her colleagues about science. So that was really cool. Thank you all for coming to this event to honor my mother. My father and I both thank you. There's over here, a number of her colleagues wrote an article about her work, and you probably have seen the link, but we have hard copies. And then there's also like a little piece of paper that shows where the tree is and has a picture. The tree's that away. And you're welcome to go see it. There's a tree and then a like seating area from which you can observe the tree, although they just put that in. So I think it's blocked off, but there's a lovely plaque, both from my father and I, and then again from her colleagues. So thank you. And then up there's sort of some umbrellas, and there's a boxed lunch that you are all welcome to share and continue the conversation. Thank you. Dana?